I never imagined a relationship could erase you completely while still demanding your support. Yet, there I was, watching him, Seraphin, systematically delete 14 months of our shared life from every corner of his social media. Our photos, our moments, gone as if I had never existed. And when I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just said casually, "I'm rebranding. Couple content doesn't perform as well as solo content. This is better for engagement." Better for engagement, not better for us. My chest tightened as his words hit me like a cold wave. He still wanted the lifestyle, the designer clothes, the professional photos, the curated Miami apartment, but he didn't want me to appear anywhere. I was invisible, yet indispensable. My money had been funding his image while my presence was erased from it. I remember sitting on the couch that evening, staring at the empty frame on the wall where our pictures used to hang. My heart felt heavy, but underneath the shock, a strange clarity began to form. For months, I had poured my energy, my money, my care into building what I thought was a partnership. And yet, he had never truly seen me, not publicly, not as an equal, not as someone whose contributions mattered. It wasn't just the deletion of photos that cut me deeply. It was the realization of how calculated it had been. Every post, every story, every curated detail of his influencer persona was a performance, one that depended entirely on my financial and emotional labor. And for what? To be invisible while enabling him to appear independent, confident, untethered? 2 days after I finally severed his access to shared accounts, the first panic messages came. Suddenly, the world he had built on my support was fragile, dependent on the very presence he had tried to erase. Watching him scramble was a revelation, not satisfaction, not revenge, but understanding. I had been complicit in a story that wasn't mine, and now, for the first time, I had the power to reclaim my narrative. I didn't yet know how far this journey would take me, how much it would test my patience, my judgment, and my self-respect. All I knew was that something fundamental had shifted. I had glimpsed the truth of who he was, and of what it truly meant to love someone who sees you as invisible while relying on you completely. And in that moment, I realized I had a choice. I could remain invisible, complicit, and exhausted, or I could step into the light, reclaim my voice, my finances, and my life. I'm Lisa, 28, a digital marketing specialist in Miami. When I met Seraphin, he was a 28-year-old, aspiring lifestyle influencer, charming and ambitious, with a growing social media presence of about 12K followers. He had a magnetic way of presenting himself, confident, carefree, effortlessly stylish, but behind that image, I didn't yet realize how dependent he was on others to maintain it. We met at a boutique where I was helping with a marketing campaign. He was reviewing clothing lines for a shoot, wearing a perfectly tailored jacket, smiling at everyone around him. I remember thinking how natural he seemed in front of the camera, how easy it was for him to radiate the kind of confidence that made people follow him. We talked about his goals, his dreams, and the content he wanted to create. I admired his ambition, and he seemed genuinely interested in my expertise, asking for advice on strategy, branding, and audience engagement. Our relationship began casually, over coffee and long walks on the beach. I was drawn to his energy, his vision for his future. Within months, I was not just his partner, I was part of his plans, part of the brand he was building. I helped him plan content calendars, suggested photo shoot locations, and even managed some of the logistical side of his lifestyle image. At first, it felt natural, helping someone you love, sharing excitement over mutual goals. But looking back, there were subtle signs I overlooked. The first was his reluctance to post us together consistently. Couple photos were sparse, often cropped or framed, so I was almost invisible. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was just about aesthetics. Then there were small moments where his attention seemed to drift when we were around friends or at events. He would check his phone obsessively, disappear to make business calls, or talk about content in a way that excluded me. My own family liked him. They saw his charm, his apparent ambition. We had dinners together, shared laughs, and he appeared genuinely invested. But I noticed the tension with his family too. His parents would ask questions about financial independence, subtly implying that I should support him less, or that his image of self-sufficiency was paramount. I dismissed it at first, believing love could navigate small conflicts. The first year felt like a whirlwind. He grew from 12K to about 30K followers, and I was proud, thinking we were building something together. I paid for professional photos, helped him with sponsorship pitches, and even covered his car lease when his old car broke down, making sure it looked Instagram ready. Salon appointments, wardrobe updates, and dining experiences for content. All of it came from me. I thought it was an investment in both our future and his dreams. The subtle erasure continued. At first, I was present in his posts, occasionally tagged in stories, visible in couple shots. Then I became the shadow behind the camera, holding his phone, suggesting angles, adjusting lighting. Eventually, I was just the quiet supporter behind the scenes, funding everything while my existence became a non-entity online. What I didn't know was that the erasure wasn't an accident. Seraphin had a vision to appear independent, effortlessly successful, and self-made, while privately relying entirely on me to sustain the lifestyle that made that vision believable. My role, unacknowledged and invisible, was essential, but only in private. Publicly, I didn't exist. Looking back now, the signs were all there. The cropped photos, the selective stories, the casual dismissal of couple content, the reliance on me for financial support, all were small hints of the deeper reality I would only confront years later. And yet, at the time, I was in love. I wanted to believe in us, in our shared future, and in the dream of building something real together. Little did I know, that dream had already been partially constructed without me, or rather, constructed in a way that erased me while depending on me completely. At first, the cracks were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they grew steadily, like tiny fractures spreading across glass. Seraphin's behavior began to change, and I felt it in my chest before I could articulate it. He was still charming, still effortlessly charismatic, but there was a distance, a compartmentalization I hadn't seen before. It started with social media. I noticed that couple photos were fewer, often cropped so I barely appeared. Stories I had thought were private seemed to exclude me entirely. When I asked about it casually, he would smile, shrug, and say, "It's just aesthetics. Followers engage more with solo content." At the time, I nodded, but a small seed of doubt planted itself. Then came the subtle financial patterns. I noticed certain payments disappearing from our shared accounts, small at first, luxury coffee runs, outfit rentals, props for photo shoots, but soon larger amounts followed. Salon visits, car maintenance, even the lease on his apartment. He had always been charmingly dismissive when I offered to split costs, insisting he could handle it himself, yet somehow my contributions kept the lifestyle intact. Friends began to notice, too. They would comment on how self-sufficient he seemed, never mentioning the role I played behind the scenes. Seraphin would laugh along with them, enjoying the illusion, while I felt a quiet tightening in my chest. I began questioning myself. Was I imagining it? Was my support genuinely invisible, or was I just too sensitive? Family interactions added another layer of tension. My parents had always encouraged independence, but they also noticed the dynamic. At dinner one evening, my mother asked casually, "Are you managing everything together, financially?" Seraphin smiled and said, "We're fine. Lisa and I have our system." But the system was entirely on my side. I didn't speak up, unsure if pointing it out would make me look petty, but the doubt began to gnaw at me. The subtle exclusion extended into conversations and decision-making. He would discuss content strategy, sponsorships, and future plans with friends and colleagues without including me. Even in private, I sometimes felt like a consultant rather than a partner. My advice was valued only insofar as it helped maintain the image he wanted the world to see. I tried to tell myself it was all part of the influencer life, the careful curation, the strategy, the need to maintain an engaging persona. But deep down, I felt an unease that refused to dissipate. The intimacy and shared vision I had believed in felt increasingly transactional. I was funding and shaping a life that only existed in his performance, not in reality. There were moments of confrontation, subtle and almost polite. "Where do I fit in all of this?" I asked one evening, over a casual dinner at home. He smiled, half distracted by his phone. "You're fine. You know I value your input." But the warmth was hollow. He never acknowledged my role publicly, never tagged me in posts, never let the world see the reality of our partnership. I began to reflect on the past months, piecing together small incidents that now seem deliberate: the cropped photos, the selective tagging, the casual dismissal of couple content, the reliance on my financial contributions. Each instance alone might have seemed inconsequential, but together they formed a clear pattern. By the end of that week, the seed of conflict had grown into a persistent tension, a shadow that hovered over every interaction. I felt my voice being muted in the spaces I once thought were shared, the intimacy I had invested in, the trust I had placed, and the love I had given, all were quietly being converted into a performance I was invisible in, yet essential to. And so, the stage was set. The dissonance between what I saw and what the world saw, between his dependence on me and his refusal to acknowledge it, had begun to fester. The conflict was subtle now, simmering beneath the surface, but I knew, deep down, that it would only grow. Something had to break before clarity could emerge, and the first cracks were already showing. It was a Thursday evening when I finally saw it, the full extent of what had been happening right under my nose. I was scrolling through Seraphine's Instagram, expecting to see our usual posts, a photo from our dinner that night, a weekend brunch, maybe even the silly couple selfies we had taken last week. Nothing. Not a single photo of us together remained. Not last week, not last month, not even the ones from our very first trip to Miami Beach. 14 months, completely erased. Every post that had once marked our time together had vanished, replaced by solo shots of him, carefully curated to project the image of an independent, self-made lifestyle influencer. My stomach dropped. I felt my heart clench, my hands tightening around my phone. I had suspected it, yes, but seeing it, seeing 14 months of shared life vanish in an instant, hit harder than I could have imagined. I confronted him that night in our apartment. He was at his laptop, editing photos for his next post, completely absorbed. I cleared my throat. "Seraphine," I said calmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I noticed. All our photos are gone. Every single one. What's going on?" He didn't even look up. "I'm rebranding," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Couple content doesn't perform as well as solo content. It's better for engagement, for my aesthetic." "For your aesthetic?" I echoed, my voice rising slightly. "What about us? What about the life we've built together? Does that mean nothing to you?" He finally glanced at me, his expression mild, almost irritated. "You don't fit into this rebrand publicly. You're still important to me personally." I froze. Personally. Privately. Useful financially? Yes. But publicly, I was invisible. I realized in that moment that I had been funding his image, supporting every expensive photo shoot, designer purchase, and lifestyle expense, while my presence, my existence, was systematically erased from the narrative he presented to the world. I felt a mixture of anger, shock, and deep, crushing sadness. The intimacy I had trusted, the partnership I had believed in, had been conditional all along. Public acknowledgement? Optional. Financial dependence? Mandatory. I tried to reason with him. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice trembling. "I've been helping you, paying for everything, supporting your career, and my only role is to disappear from the story? To be invisible while you profit from our life?" He shrugged, almost bored. "It's just content strategy. I need to maintain the image for my followers. Having a boyfriend in every post doesn't help. You understand that, right?" I stared at him, my mind racing. Everything I had done, the professional photos, the apartment lease, the car payments, the boutique wardrobe updates, even the salon appointments, had been supporting a version of him the world saw as independent. And now I understood that independence was a performance, one built entirely on my support, my contributions, and my erasure. I felt a surge of clarity, sharp and electrifying. The realization that I had been invisible in someone else's narrative while funding it ignited something inside me. This wasn't just about Instagram or branding or aesthetics. This was about respect, about recognition, about not being treated as expendable. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stayed calm, letting the weight of the truth settle between us. And then, quietly, I made my decision. If he wanted to erase me publicly, then I would reclaim control of my contributions. The financial ties that had sustained his performance would no longer exist without my consent. In the days that followed, I methodically removed his access to every shared account, every credit card, every autopay I had set up. His car payments stopped. His apartment lease was no longer funded. Every financial support I had quietly provided was gone. And then I watched. I watched as the first panic messages arrived, as the carefully curated life he had projected so confidently began to falter. I felt no satisfaction, no vindictive joy, just a quiet sense of justice, of boundaries enforced, of reality restored. For the first time in months, I felt truly present in my own life, rather than a ghost haunting someone else's narrative. And in that moment, I realized something profound. When someone systematically erases you from their public life while depending on you privately, they are telling you exactly how much you matter to them. The first night after confronting Seraphin, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, my thoughts racing faster than my heart could keep pace. 14 months. 14 months of shared experiences, of laughter, of support, of love, or what I thought was love, systematically erased. I felt shock first, sharp and cold. Then came anger, simmering beneath my skin, making my hands twitch and my jaw ache. How had I been so blind? How had I believed in a partnership that existed for everyone else, but not for me? I replayed every memory, every small sign I had ignored. The cropped photos, the selective stories, the casual dismissal of couple content, all now glaringly obvious. My mind flashed back to every dinner where he had spoken to friends about content strategy and left me out. Every weekend when I funded the shoots, the outfits, the trips, while he smiled and presented it as his own work. But amid the shock and anger, a quieter emotion began to rise. Clarity. I started asking myself hard questions. Had I really been naive, or had I simply chosen not to see? Had I allowed love to blind me to the transactional reality that had been forming in front of me? I thought about responsibility, not his, mine. I had been enabling this imbalance. I had assumed that love meant sacrifice without recognition. I had believed that supporting someone's dreams, financially and emotionally, required invisibility on my part. I realized I had been complicit in my own erasure. I trusted him, I whispered to myself, feeling the sting of betrayal. I gave everything, and he didn't even see me. The next day, I made a quiet plan. I wouldn't confront him again immediately, not with shouting or tears, not yet. I needed to reclaim my agency first, to set boundaries and enforce them. That night, I reviewed our shared accounts, every joint subscription, every credit card. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming control over the parts of my life that had been used to fund someone else's illusion. I began methodically severing the financial ties. Credit card privileges revoked, shared accounts closed, auto pay and subscriptions stopped. Every dollar I had quietly contributed was now under my control again. Even as I did it, a part of me felt guilty. Was I being too harsh? Was I punishing him for a business decision he had made? But the more I reflected, the clearer it became. This wasn't punishment. It was alignment. I could no longer be a silent enabler for someone who treated my existence as optional. Emotionally, the process was exhausting. I oscillated between relief and grief. Relief, because I was finally taking action, reclaiming my space, asserting my value. Grief, because the realization of how little I had truly been seen cut deep. I mourned the version of our relationship I had believed in, the partnership, the mutual support, the shared dreams. All of it had been a carefully curated performance, not reality. I reached out to a friend that evening, someone outside our world, to speak honestly. I feel invisible, even though I've been everything he needs, I confessed. Her response was grounding. You're not invisible, Lisa. You're just finally seeing the truth. That clarity, that's power. Use it wisely. I let her words settle. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of empowerment beneath the pain. I realized I didn't have to be angry, didn't have to lash out, didn't have to dramatize the situation. I could simply assert my boundaries, reclaim my life, and let reality unfold on its own. And so I did. Quietly, methodically, with a focus that came from years of self-discipline and emotional intelligence, I began dismantling the structures that had kept me invisible while supporting him. I didn't yet know the consequences he would face or how our social circles would react, but for the first time in over a year, I felt aligned with myself. I had been erased, yes, but only temporarily. I was stepping out of the shadow he had cast over me, and even though the path forward would be challenging, I knew one thing with certainty. I would no longer allow my value to be measured by someone else's willingness to acknowledge it publicly. Once I began reclaiming my financial boundaries, the world around us shifted rapidly. It started subtly, with Seraphin noticing that certain bills were no longer being paid automatically. At first, he assumed it was a temporary glitch, a mistake, perhaps even a technical error. But as he dug deeper, frustration quickly turned to panic. He came home one evening, face flushed, pacing across our apartment, trying to understand why the car payment had been missed. "Lisa, what did you do?" he demanded, voice tight, almost incredulous. I remained seated on the couch, my laptop open, calmly sipping tea. "Rebranding," I said simply. "For my own aesthetic." He froze, then laughed nervously. "You're overreacting. This is extreme. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, steady and unwavering. "You decided that your public life would exclude me, that I was only useful privately, financially. I'm merely aligning the reality with the image you've already created." The conversation escalated quickly from there. Seraphin's friends, who had always supported his solo content strategy, began taking sides. Some justified his behavior, saying it was normal for couples to separate financial support from public content. Others began questioning the ethics of erasing a partner entirely while depending on them. A photographer friend, Bram, accidentally revealed that Seraphin had been planning a solo lifestyle rebrand months in advance, confirming my suspicions. The stakes heightened when his family got involved. His parents, who had always subtly implied that he needed to appear independent, arrived one evening with a tense energy. They cornered me in the kitchen while he stormed to the living room, phone pressed to his ear, muttering to someone about financial sabotage. "Lisa," his mother said, voice clipped, "this is unkind. You're punishing him for making a business decision. Surely you can be reasonable." I met her gaze steadily, feeling the weight of her judgment, but refusing to flinch. "I'm not punishing him," I said firmly. "I'm responding to being systematically erased from his life while funding every aspect of it. If being visible and valued is unreasonable, then yes, I'm taking steps to correct that." His father looked skeptical. "But you've been together for over a year. Don't you trust him?" I exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch. I trusted him. For 14 months, I gave everything: time, money, care, and yet my existence was optional. Invisible publicly, indispensable privately. Trust isn't conditional. Respect isn't optional. The next week was a storm. Social gatherings became tense, with mutual friends asking pointed questions. "Why didn't you just post less couple content instead of deleting everything?" one friend asked. Seraphin laughed awkwardly, brushing it off, but I saw the tension behind his confident facade. Financially, the consequences were immediate. His car lease was at risk. Monthly bills were overdue. The apartment, curated for his Instagram aesthetics, suddenly became unaffordable without my contributions. He scrambled, calling and texting me with a mix of desperation and indignation, asking for temporary reinstatement of access. Each time, I remained calm, explaining my reasoning. My support had always come with invisibility. That was no longer acceptable. I began noticing subtle changes in his behavior. The charming, carefree persona he projected online started to crack under pressure. The confidence that once drew followers now looked forced, anxious. Late-night content planning sessions turned tense. Even the way he smiled in photos had become slightly strained, as if he were aware the illusion he had built was beginning to collapse. Meanwhile, I started documenting everything. Receipts, account changes, screenshots, nothing for revenge, but for clarity, for understanding, and to ensure that no one could misrepresent the situation. There was a growing tension between the image he wanted to sell and the reality he was now forced to confront. Every confrontation, every argument, every moment of resistance escalated the situation further. Seraphin tried to regain control through charm and manipulation, insisting that I was punishing him or being extreme, but I remained grounded in the reality I had reclaimed. He couldn't argue with facts. He had built a public persona dependent on my support, and now, for the first time, the financial reality aligned with the public narrative he had constructed. One evening, after a particularly heated argument about sponsorships he could no longer afford, he finally blurted out, voice raw, "You've ruined everything." I looked him in the eye, steady, unflinching. "No," I said softly but firmly. "I've restored balance. I've reclaimed my value. You've always had the choice to include me publicly or remain dependent privately. You chose the latter, and now reality is catching up with the fantasy you've sold." By this point, the escalation wasn't just financial. It was social, emotional, and psychological. Friends were divided, his family tense, his public image beginning to falter. The tension that had simmered for months had finally erupted into full visibility, exposing the contradictions in his carefully curated life. And through it all, I began noticing a shift inside myself. I was no longer merely reacting to his erasure or his dependence. I was growing stronger, more decisive, more aligned with my own sense of justice and self-respect. Each confrontation, each uncomfortable conversation reinforced my clarity. The escalation wasn't just about Seraphin's collapse, it was about my own empowerment. For the first time in months, I felt the intoxicating combination of control and peace. I was no longer invisible, no longer a silent enabler. The stakes had risen, yes, but so had my understanding of what I deserved. By the end of that turbulent week, it was clear. This was no longer just about social media or finances. It was a reckoning, a test of boundaries, integrity, and self-respect. And as I watched the cracks widen in the carefully constructed facade he had depended on me to maintain, I realized something profound. Sometimes escalation is necessary for clarity. By the end of the second week, the apartment felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had changed. I sat alone on the couch, staring at the city lights outside the window, feeling the emptiness of the space I had once shared so fully. 14 months of memories, of shared routines and laughter, now existed only in my mind. Publicly, in the world he curated, I did not exist. It wasn't just that he had erased me. It was the cumulative weight of every subtle exclusion, every invisible moment, every time I had poured myself into someone else's life while remaining unseen. I felt a profound loneliness, a sense of isolation so deep it made my chest ache. Friends were divided, some quietly supporting him, some asking questions, but none could fully understand the erosion of intimacy I had endured. I thought about the nights I had stayed up helping him plan content, arranging outfits, editing photos, strategizing sponsorships. I remembered the days I had spent quietly paying bills, managing appointments, and covering expenses so he could project independence and confidence. All of it, the energy, the time, the money, had been invisible to the public, invisible to him in the way I had wanted to matter. I remembered that moment at his laptop when I realized the erasure was deliberate, the casual tone in which he dismissed me, the mild irritation that I even questioned it. It had cut me deeper than I ever expected. It wasn't just about social media or money. It was about the fundamental truth that the person I loved saw me as optional, a convenience, and nothing more. Tears came quietly, unbidden, as I replayed every memory of support met with indifference. The betrayal felt multidimensional: financial, emotional, social, and existential. I had been funding his fantasy while existing outside it, and now the reality was unavoidable. The fantasy had collapsed, but the emotional wreckage was mine to navigate. I questioned everything. Had I been naive? Had I ignored warning signs? The cropped photos, the selective stories, the casual dismissal of couple content, all the little things that had seemed inconsequential now formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I felt the weight of self-doubt pressing down, whispering that perhaps I had been complicit in my own invisibility. Isolation deepened further when his panic messages arrived. He was frantic, desperate, trying to regain access to accounts, payments, and privileges. I read them carefully, but the words felt hollow. His urgency was not about the relationship, not about me. It was about the collapse of the image and lifestyle he had relied on me to maintain. I felt anger flare, but it was interwoven with exhaustion. I was mentally and emotionally drained. For the first time, I understood how invisible labor, the kind that sustains someone else's public persona, could erode a person's sense of self entirely. I had been present for him in every way but one, truly seen. And now, stripped of the illusion I had maintained, I faced the raw truth of that invisibility. Sleep became difficult. I lay awake at night, heart racing, mind circling the betrayal and the loss. The apartment felt cavernous, each echo of my thoughts magnified in the emptiness. I walked from room to room, touching objects that had once felt shared, now marking spaces that existed solely for him and the persona he presented to the world. Even ordinary routines, making coffee, checking emails, arranging my own schedule, felt heavy. Every small task was a reminder of the months I had devoted to sustaining a life that had never fully included me. My sense of self, once confident and grounded, now wavered. For the first time, I wondered if the person I had believed in even existed, or if I had only loved an image, carefully constructed and carefully maintained at my expense. Yet beneath the despair, a quiet ember of clarity persisted. I realized that the collapse of this illusion, the isolation, the heartbreak, they were not merely pain. They were signals, guiding me toward self-recognition, toward the understanding that I had been undervaluing myself. This was the dark moment, yes, the emotional nadir where I felt abandoned, unseen, and betrayed, but it was also the threshold. I understood, in the depths of that darkness, that something had to change, that the life I had devoted to someone else, the love I had poured into a persona rather than a person, had to be reclaimed. The heartbreak was not just loss. It was an opportunity to reclaim agency, to recognize my worth, and to confront the illusion that had long masked the truth. For hours I sat in that stillness, breathing slowly, feeling the ache in my chest, and acknowledging the reality. I had been invisible, but I was not powerless. I had been erased, but I could now step forward into clarity and strength. The dark moment had come, but it was also preparing me for the turning point, a realization that would transform grief into resolve, invisibility into empowerment. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, in the quiet of a Tuesday morning. I was going through emails and receipts, reviewing every account, every shared subscription, every dollar I had spent over the past year supporting Seraphin's lifestyle. And there it was, a series of documents, messages, and confirmations that made the truth undeniable. He had systematically relied on me for everything: the apartment lease, the car, the boutique purchases, the professional photography sessions, the social media management tools. Every solo post he celebrated as independent success had been funded entirely by me. And not just funded, the public narrative actively erased my contributions. My existence, my support, my life had been carefully edited out of the story he presented to the world. I stared at the evidence, heart pounding, hands trembling, and a strange mix of emotions swept over me. Anger, yes, but also a profound sense of clarity. For the first time, the chaos and heartbreak transformed into understanding. I wasn't just a victim of erasure. I was someone who had been undervalued in every dimension of this relationship. And now, with proof in hand, I could reclaim my power. Later that day, I met with a friend, neutral and perceptive, someone who knew Seraphin professionally but had no personal stake. I laid out everything: the financials, the deleted photos, the strategic erasure. She listened quietly, her eyes widening as the story unfolded. "This isn't just poor judgment or a bad relationship," she said finally. "He's been building an illusion on your contributions. You've been funding a fictional independence, and the worst part is, he's convinced himself that erasing you publicly is okay. It's manipulation, disguised as content strategy." Hearing it framed that way was liberating. It wasn't my fault. I hadn't failed to support him. I had been supporting him fully. The failure was his failure to value me as a partner, as a person, as an equal. That realization struck me like a wave. I returned home that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. Seraphin was editing photos for his next post, unaware that the person who had been his invisible backbone had finally decided to step fully into her own agency. I sat across from him, calm, composed, and resolute. "I've been reviewing everything," I began, my voice steady. "The bills, the accounts, the contributions I've made over the past 14 months. I have all the proof here, and I've realized something important." He looked up, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" I mean, I continued, that I've been funding your lifestyle, supporting your content, and being erased from your public life. And I've decided that I will no longer accept being invisible while sustaining someone else's image. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the carefully maintained confidence he projected. The tension in the room was electric. This isn't revenge, I clarified. This isn't about punishment. It's about boundaries. I will continue to live my life fully, but I will not be a silent enabler for someone who refuses to acknowledge my presence. My support, my care, my contributions, they are not optional in the world I occupy, and if you cannot see me, then that's your choice. The decision felt monumental, though inwardly it was simple. I had endured invisibility long enough. The evidence, the clarity, the conversations with a trusted friend, they had all combined to create a moment of empowerment. I could act now with certainty and integrity. Seraphin tried to argue, of course. He attempted charm, guilt, rationalization. I was just protecting the brand, he said. You don't understand how important it is. I shook my head gently. I understand perfectly. You build a brand on someone else's labor and then erase them. That's not protection. It's exploitation, and I will no longer participate in it. In that moment, I recognized the truth of my own value. I was more than financial support, more than a background figure in someone else's life. I had agency, power, and clarity. I could step away from invisibility and claim my worth fully. That night, as I closed my laptop and looked around the apartment, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't known in months. The fear, the heartbreak, the anger, they were still there, yes, but beneath it was a solid foundation, the knowledge that I had finally reclaimed control of my life. The turning point was not a dramatic confrontation, not an explosive argument. It was the quiet, powerful realization that my value could not be ignored, that my presence mattered, and that I had the right to insist on recognition. From this moment forward, everything would change, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I had chosen to honor myself. And in that choice, I discovered a profound truth. Empowerment often begins with clarity, and clarity is born from recognizing the reality of your own worth. The days following my decision to reclaim my agency were surreal. Seraphin's carefully curated world began to unravel almost immediately. His followers, sponsors, and even some of his friends started noticing inconsistencies between the image he projected and the reality that had been quietly documented behind the scenes. It began on Instagram. A follower, diligent and curious, noticed a discrepancy between his high-end lifestyle posts and his publicly visible financial activity. Screenshots circulated and questions arose. If he's living such a lavish lifestyle, who is actually funding it? Comments became more pointed, discussions more heated. It was subtle at first, but the narrative was shifting, and the cracks were widening. Brands quickly responded. Sponsorship deals began to falter as companies realized the persona Seraphin was selling. Independent, self-made, confident, was heavily dependent on my support. Campaigns promoting luxury lifestyle, independence, and self-reliance were suddenly incompatible with the reality of his financial dependence. 3 major contracts were canceled within days, a clear and immediate fallout of the truth emerging. Even friends and acquaintances, those who had quietly sided with him, began to step back. They were uncomfortable, not because I had acted unfairly, but because the illusion they had been part of was no longer sustainable. Subtle social exclusion turned into overt questioning. Friends began asking uncomfortable questions at gatherings. How long has this been going on? Did you ever acknowledge her publicly? Seraphin's attempts at deflection fell flat, leaving him isolated in a world he had once controlled. At home, the tension was palpable. He would scroll through his notifications, the anxiety in his movements growing with each new comment or message. I observed him quietly, noting how the person I had known, charming, confident, almost untouchable, was now visibly unsettled. The power dynamic had shifted. For months, I had been invisible and powerless in his narrative. Now, the truth was undeniable, and he was the one under scrutiny. Financial repercussions followed swiftly. Without my continued contributions, his lifestyle became unsustainable. The apartment, which had been a showcase for content, was beyond his financial reach. Car payments lapsed. Salon visits, boutique shopping sprees, and other luxury expenditures, all once funded quietly by me, were abruptly curtailed. For someone whose image depended on these markers of success, the collapse was humiliating and inevitable. Yet throughout all of this, I remained calm. I did not seek revenge. I did not make public statements or posts intended to humiliate. Instead, I focused on my own life, quietly observing the unraveling from a distance. The serenity I felt was almost intoxicating. For the first time in over a year, I was living unburdened by someone else's image or demands. When Seraphin confronted me weeks later, desperate to salvage both his lifestyle and our relationship, I simply stated the facts. "I've removed my support," I said evenly. "I will no longer participate in a life where my existence is optional and invisible. You chose the public narrative. Now you face the consequences." He attempted to frame it as punitive, calling my actions extreme, cruel, or unnecessary. But I knew better. I was merely holding a mirror up to the reality he had created. Every sponsorship lost, every questioning comment from followers, every whisper of doubt from friends, it was a direct result of the choices he had made, not my response. Eventually, Seraphin moved back in with his parents in Coral Gables. The apartment was surrendered. The car was repossessed. The lavish lifestyle that had once been so carefully presented on Instagram and other social platforms no longer existed. His social media presence continued, but the shine had dulled. Engagement dropped, follower growth slowed, and the perception of authenticity, once a cornerstone of his brand, was irreparably damaged. Throughout this, I rebuilt my own life quietly, methodically. I focused on career goals, personal growth, and emotional recovery. I invested in myself in ways that had been impossible while sustaining someone else's illusion. For the first time in over a year, I felt financial stability, emotional clarity, and personal freedom. Friends began to notice the change in me. I was lighter, more confident, less stressed, more present. My social media reflected my real life, authentic, grounded, and independent, not curated to fit someone else's narrative. Conversations with close friends emphasized the contrast. "You're glowing," they said. "It's like you finally stopped carrying someone else's life on your shoulders." And indeed, I had. The fallout was complete, not because I had sought to destroy him, but because the truth, once aligned with reality, had a way of correcting itself. Seraphin's collapse was a consequence of the choices he had made, erasing me publicly while relying on my support privately. The narrative he had built was fragile, and once the foundation was removed, the structure could not stand. In the aftermath, I did not gloat. I did not post about his failures or exploit the situation for attention. I simply moved forward, grounded in the knowledge that I had honored myself and set boundaries that protected my integrity. I had been erased for 14 months, but I emerged fully seen, fully valued, and fully alive. The experience left an indelible lesson. When someone treats you as optional, you have the power to realign your life and reclaim your worth. The universe, in its own way, often mirrors back the reality we allow to persist. Seraphin had created a fictional life dependent on my presence. Once I stepped into my own power, the truth revealed itself, and he bore the consequences of his choices. By the time the Miami summer began to wane, I was firmly grounded. I had reclaimed my life, my finances, and my emotional space. The apartment, the car, the lavish content, all gone. But what remained was more valuable: my clarity, my autonomy, and the knowledge that I could never again be invisible in my own story. Months have passed since the storm settled, and life feels lighter now. The apartment is mine to inhabit fully, my finances secure, and my social media finally reflects the reality I live: authentic, grounded, and uncurated. I no longer scroll through posts wondering if my presence is valued, because I know it is, not as an accessory to someone else's image, but as a person with my own worth and agency. I've started dating again, slowly, cautiously, but with a clarity I never had before. My new partner, Steve, is independent, respectful, and values reciprocity in both emotion and support. We share laughter, experiences, and companionship without the shadow of invisibility or exploitation. It's a relief, yes, but more importantly, it's empowering. I've learned to protect my space, my energy, and my resources, both emotional and financial. Looking back at Seraphin, I feel neither rage nor bitterness. The lessons are clearer than any resentment could ever be. His collapse was not my doing. It was the natural consequence of choices built on erasure and illusion. I realized that trying to coexist in someone else's fabricated life comes at the expense of your own authenticity. And when that authenticity is finally reclaimed, the world aligns to reflect it. The hardest realization, and the most valuable one, was understanding how long I had tolerated being optional. 14 months of quietly funding someone else's lifestyle taught me about boundaries, respect, and the importance of being seen. I had mistaken my generosity for love, my patience for loyalty, and my support for partnership. True partnership never erases, it elevates. Now I invest in my own life fully. I save, plan, and build with intention. My career flourishes because I no longer expend mental energy managing someone else's fiction. My social media reflects joy, authenticity, and the life I truly live. Every post, every share, every moment of visibility belongs to me. I am no longer invisible. I am fully, unapologetically seen. For anyone watching, this story isn't just about social media or finances. It's about self-worth. It's about recognizing when your presence is undervalued and having the courage to reclaim it. You deserve relationships where your contributions, presence, and life matter equally. Never optional, never invisible. The ultimate lesson I carry forward is simple yet profound. Authenticity is the most valuable filter in life, and it cannot be bought, edited, or erased. It is lived, honored, and defended. I learned that the best way to ensure respect is to demand it for yourself first. Today, I am grateful. Grateful for the clarity, for the boundaries I now maintain, and for the life I finally claim as my own. I am free, whole, and unhidden, and that, more than any follower count or sponsored post, is the truest measure of independence.